When we think of ancient Egypt, the picture is almost always the same, right? Gleaming gold, majestic pharaohs, and flawless beauty. But peel back the layers, and the raw, gritty reality behind those thick palace walls 3,000 years ago was a daily battle against relentless enemies. The punishing desert sun, the ever-invading sand, and deadly diseases. How did one of the world's oldest civilizations stay clean and fragrant without the comfort of indoor plumbing or a simple bar of soap? What you're about to discover shatters that old, romanticized illusion. Egyptian hygiene was a brutal mix of highly dangerous chemicals, animal fat, and raw survival methods that would shock modern medicine. If you're like us, and you value these deep dives into the true human side of history, hit that like button right now. It's a small gesture, but it fuels our fire to keep bringing you these untold stories. Subscribe to the channel, join our community, and let us know in the comments. Does this raw history fascinate you or terrify you? Stepping out of the cool shadows of a stone palace and slamming into the suffocating 100+ degree heat of the African desert was a daily shock to the system. For this fascinating civilization, hygiene was far from just a matter of vanity or looking good for the nobility's grand banquets. It was, against all odds, a brutal, relentless matter of survival. Living on the banks of the mighty Nile meant dealing not only with the blessing of fertile soil, but with the unforgiving fury of Mother Nature. Unpredictable seasonal floods, stagnant waters, swarms of disease-carrying insects, and a scorching sun that offered zero mercy. In this deeply hostile landscape, letting dirt, dust, and sweat cake on your skin was basically signing your own death warrant by infection. When we crack open the ancient medical texts that survived the sands of time, we see a violently pragmatic approach to the human body, forged in fire by the harshness of their world and their sheer desperation to stay strong. But there was another layer, something much deeper, that drove this extreme obsession with cleanliness, an unyielding spiritual mandate. In the Egyptian mind, the gods were beings of absolute purity. For a mere mortal to even dare set foot inside a sacred temple, or to secure a safe, dignified passage into the coveted afterlife, being physically spotless wasn't optional. It was the law. Priests went to jaw-dropping extremes, plunging into cold water multiple times a day and in the dead of night, just to ensure no human odor would offend the divine. Being dirty was viewed by the entire society as a direct assault on Ma'at, the sacred principle of truth, balance, and the cosmic order of the universe. So, when an everyday Egyptian scrubbed away the heavy dust of the day, they weren't just warding off unwanted parasites. In their minds, they were literally washing their soul, syncing themselves up with the very gears of life. And it was exactly because of this dual mandate, the rigorous upkeep of the physical body and the eternal salvation of the soul, that they used their undeniable brilliance to invent personal care rituals we still use today. But here's the catch. Tucked among the luxurious alabaster jars and delicate makeup palettes on their ancient vanity tables sat a specific cosmetic that harbors a dark secret. It's a secret most history books leave out. This was a product used religiously, every single day, coating the faces of everyone from the most powerful pharaoh down to the most sun-beaten peasant in the fields. What almost nobody tells you is that the formula for this cosmetic contained an ingredient modern science classifies as highly toxic, a lethal poison to the human body. And this flips everything we know about early medicine completely upside down. Because, ironically, it was this exact aggressive poison that saved thousands of Egyptians from one of the ancient world's greatest plagues. Irreversible blindness caused by bacteria carried by the flies of the Nile. Later in our historical journey, we're going to reveal what this deadly secret was and why it worked like magic. But before we decode that bizarre alchemy, we need to go back to square one. After all, how do you take a decent bath and scrape off a crust of desert sand and sweat when a single bar of soap simply doesn't exist? To understand how this society tackled heavy dirt, we have to look at the main artery that kept Egypt pumping: the mighty Nile River. Water was the ancient world's most precious resource, but access to it exposed a massive, gaping social wound, highlighting the stark divide between those who ruled from golden thrones and those who broke their backs under the unforgiving sun. For the everyday peasant, the man or woman who spent hours plowing fertile mud and dragging massive stones, bath time didn't happen in the cozy privacy of a locked room. The ritual meant wading straight into the muddy waters of the river itself, or the shallow irrigation canals. And here is a detail Hollywood loves to gloss over. Taking a dip in the Nile required nerves of absolute steel. The riverbanks were the natural hunting grounds for monstrous crocodiles and intensely territorial hippos, apex predators that claimed countless lives. It was a high-stakes bath. You splashed water on your skin while keeping one eye glued to the dark shoreline, where the line between getting clean and becoming prey was terrifyingly thin. But pivot your gaze to the luxurious limestone palaces, and it was a completely different world. The Egyptian elite, the pharaohs, the high priests, the nobility, enjoyed a setup that rivaled a modern-day luxury spa. Their sprawling estates featured exclusive bathing chambers engineered with slightly sloped stone slabs for perfect drainage. In these cool, shaded sanctuaries, miles away from the jaws of any wild predator, a nobleman simply sat on a stool, while servants poured endless clay jugs of fresh, cool water over his tired shoulders. The problem? Whether you were risking life and limb in the Nile or kicking back in a lavish palace, everyone hit the exact same technological brick wall. There was an absolute absence of soap. Forget that thick, fragrant lather that glides easily across your skin. To strip away that stubborn crust of desert sand and the oily sweat clogging their pores, they needed something rough, something abrasive. And in that desperate scenario, they turned to natron. Natron was a naturally occurring mineral salt, an aggressive blend of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, harvested by hand from the edges of dried-up lake beds, baking under the hellish desert sun. To create their primitive cleansing cosmetic, they took this crystallized ground-up salt and mixed it with plant ashes, forming a harsh paste with the texture of coarse sandpaper. An Egyptian bath wasn't a gentle wash, it was a brutally aggressive exfoliation. You scrubbed this mixture hard against your body to literally scrape away dead skin and break down human fat molecules. Did it leave the skin clean? Without a doubt. But it also left it raw, stripped, and intensely dry. To fix that, they had to slather themselves in plant oils and animal fats immediately afterward, just to lock the moisture back in and stop their flesh from painfully cracking open. And this totally shatters our illusion of ancient, delicate beauty routines. But the most mind-blowing detail, the one that truly highlights the dark genius of this civilization, is the salt itself. The exact same abrasive powder used to wash the pharaoh's face at the crack of dawn was the primary chemical used inside the dark, heavy air of the embalming tents. Yes, the salt that cleansed the living was the very same dehydrating compound priests packed onto lifeless corpses for 70 long days. Its job was to suck the moisture from the flesh and create the iconic mummies that sit behind museum glass today. The pragmatic line between daily hygiene for the living and heavy-duty chemistry for eternal death was, at the end of the day, just a matter of dosage. But even with a body purified and scrubbed raw with salt, the brutal daily battle was far from over. Water and natron perfectly solved the problem of heavy dirt, but they offered zero defense against a tiny, lightning-fast threat buzzing all around them. The harsh reality was that the fertile banks of the Nile, the very mud that put bread on the table and fueled an empire, were an absolute paradise for massive, relentless swarms of flies and disease-carrying bugs. Among these winged plagues was a constant threat hovering right in front of their faces: aggressive bacteria that triggered devastating eye infections, often leading to total, irreversible blindness. And here's a provocative question for you, one that demands an honest answer. How far would you go? And what kind of bizarre, terrifying substance would you willingly rub directly into your own eyes if it was the only way to guarantee you wouldn't lose your sight in the middle of the desert wasteland? The ancient Egyptians' answer to this life-or-death dilemma didn't come from empty spells or magic. It came from one of the most iconic, yet deeply misunderstood items in their entire culture: the famous black eyeliner, known to history as kohl. When we gaze upon the elegant bust of Queen Nefertiti, or the striking death mask of the boy king, Tutankhamun, the very first thing that pulls us in are those almond-shaped eyes, heavily framed by thick, dark lines of makeup. For centuries, academics and Hollywood alike wrote off this ancient practice as a mere aesthetic whim, an exotic beauty standard designed to flaunt power and vanity. But the hard, documented truth, now backed by rigorous modern chemical analysis, completely flips the script. It finally solves the mystery we left hanging at the start of our journey. Egyptian kohl was far from just a seductive ornament or a status symbol to show off at royal banquets. At its rawest core, it was forged from a dense mixture of crushed minerals, ash, animal fat, and, shockingly, massive amounts of galena. Galena is an ore incredibly rich in lead sulfide. You heard that right. The daily foundation of an entire civilization's makeup routine was a heavy, unforgiving metal, one that modern science classifies as highly toxic to the human body. And it was right here that the empirical genius of the ancient world pulled off a literal miracle of survival. Rubbing ground lead directly into the moisture of your eyes sounds like a tragically lethal idea to any modern doctor. But for them, this dangerous alchemy created an impenetrable chemical fortress. The moment contaminated dust or bacteria-laden flies made contact with the makeup, the lead released compounds that instantly kick-started the immune cells to produce nitric oxide. By some cruel irony of fate and sheer human grit, the poison became a powerhouse antibacterial agent, annihilating microorganisms long before they could trigger festering infections. That thick, black streak across the face of a humble peasant or an untouchable pharaoh wasn't some shallow beauty routine. It was, in fact, the very first widely documented preventive medicine in the long history of mankind. But there was a practical, everyday detail that made this dark paste even more vital for life outside the shaded palace walls. Under the violent North African sun, the glare bouncing off the pale sand was blindingly unbearable. It exhausted the eyes and sabotaged the back-breaking labor in the fields and the construction of massive stone monuments. The opaque rim of kohl functioned exactly like the eye-black modern athletes wear today. It absorbed the excessive glare and deflected the desert's relentless, blinding light, keeping their vision sharp and focused. That flawless aesthetic we admire so much today? It was just a side effect of a brutal strategy against an unforgiving environment. Yet, shielding their eyes and scrubbing their skin with salt was only the first stage of this ongoing physical war. The The suffocating climate demanded even more extreme measures against a different kind of enemy, one that hit much closer to home than they ever wanted. Shielding their eyes with toxic makeup and scraping their skin with abrasive salt were hardcore survival tactics, but they were just the first line of defense. The harsh reality was that the scorching heat of North Africa, combined with masses of people packed tightly along the humid banks of the Nile, created the perfect breeding ground for a stealthy, creeping enemy: parasites. Dealing with lice and ticks wasn't just a nuisance that caused a few sleepless nights in the worker villages. These bugs were relentless vectors for lethal fevers, capable of wiping out entire populations in a matter of weeks. And it was right here, in the shadow of constant looming calamity, that Egyptian society adopted a public health measure so extreme it bordered on self-mutilation. Their ultimate solution to win this silent war was the absolute eradication of any possible safe haven for these insects. In daily practice, that meant total, merciless hair removal. Throw out that romantic Hollywood image of long, flowing black hair blowing in the desert wind. The true face of ancient Egypt, backed up by rigorous historical records, was overwhelmingly bald. Men, women, and even children had their heads methodically shaved, almost always extending this punishing practice to every single hair on their bodies. To their fiercely pragmatic minds, sporting a head of hair that collected sweat under a blazing 100-degree sun was the ultimate sign of filth, an open door for plagues and the wrath of the gods. To keep that skin perfectly smooth, they forged an arsenal of rudimentary surgical tools, including heavy bronze razors that demanded constant sharpening on polished stones just to ensure an aggressive, surgically close shave against their own flesh. But there was a fascinating catch, one that exposed the deep, undeniable social divide of the ancient world. If every single citizen was shaving their head for strict sanitary reasons, how on earth was the nobility supposed to flaunt their wealth to the lower classes? The majestic answer to that problem fueled one of the most lucrative industries of the ancient world: high-end luxury wigs. The Egyptian elite paraded through grand courtyards wearing incredibly elaborate pieces made of genuine human hair, tightly braided with wool and locked into place with beeswax. These artificial crowns held a brilliant tactical advantage. At the end of a long, extravagant banquet, the nobleman simply took off the wig, letting his scalp breathe freely. The precious hairpiece was then handed off to servants to be boiled and heavily treated with insecticidal oils, keeping the parasites at a very safe distance. And this completely changes what we know about the ancient origins of our own modern beauty routines. The brutal necessity of keeping the body flawless drove the invention of hair removal techniques that survive today in high-end cosmetic clinics. Ancient alchemists formulated thick pastes by boiling rustic cauldrons of honey, natural tree resins, and sugar-like compounds. This dark, sticky mixture, applied piping hot to damp skin and ripped off in one violent jerk with thick strips of linen, took with it not just stubborn body hair, but the top layer of dirt and dead skin. It was an excruciatingly painful process, endured stoically by a society that understood one simple truth: a single contaminated louse was a far deadlier threat than the sharp, burning sting of boiling honey on bare skin. Yet, even with a body that was shaved smooth and scrubbed raw, another massive physical dilemma urgently needed to be solved. The problem was, even if you were rocking a perfectly smooth body, rigorously exfoliated with desert salt, and completely free from microscopic parasites, there was still the elephant in the room. How did a society packed shoulder to shoulder in massive stone halls manage to mask the heavy, undeniable stench of human sweat? We're talking about an empire built in a region where thermometers would easily smash past 100 degrees, making sweat a continuous, sticky, and unavoidable fact of life. For the ruling elite, smelling bad was far from just a passing inconvenience. It was considered an unforgivable social blunder and a literal spiritual failure, one that pushed them further away from the purity demanded by the gods. It was born from this desperate need to smell divine that ancient Egypt cemented its place in history as the undisputed perfume capital of the ancient world. They elevated scent extraction to a hard science, creating entire industries dedicated to pressing blue water lilies and boiling rare spices dragged back from dangerous naval expeditions. This gave birth to legendary creations like the famous Kai-Fi, a blend so intensely complex, its exact recipe was guarded under lock and key by high priests. But Egyptian perfumery didn't use those volatile, alcohol-based sprays we know today. Their scents were heavy, dense, and based almost entirely on slow-steeping botanical infusions, mixed into plant oils and thick layers of animal fat. And there is one incredibly bizarre, highly cinematic detail that perfectly captures just how far this elite class would go to mask body odor during their lavish high society events. When we look at the breathtaking frescoes painted on ancient tomb walls, we often see banquet guests depicted with a strange, cone-shaped object resting right on top of their heads. For decades, archaeologists assumed this was just some sort of symbolic adornment. But modern science finally confirmed the visceral, shocking reality. These were heavy, solid cones made of pure animal fat, usually ox or sheep tallow, that had been saturated for weeks on end with the most potent floral essences in the entire Pharaonic Empire. The way this cosmetic contraption worked was an absolute spectacle of primitive chemistry. As the guests ate, drank, and the temperature of the hall inevitably spiked with the intense body heat of the crowd, that block of fat strapped tightly to their wig began to melt. Painfully slowly, hot, intensely scented animal fat would trickle down their braided hair, drip down their faces, coat their necks, and gradually seep deep into their pristine white linen tunics. To us, sitting comfortably in the 21st century, the idea of spending an entire evening at a party with hot animal lard melting down a sweaty forehead sounds downright grotesque, but to them, it was the absolute pinnacle of luxury and high-class refinement. This continuous melting created an impenetrable aromatic curtain, masking any trace of stale sweat and actually providing a strange, cooling relief against the suffocating, stale air of the room. And that completely shatters our modern ideas about the flawless appearances of ancient history. However, rocking a stunning body on the outside and clothes that reeked of the finest perfumes in the known world didn't mean a thing if the very food you ate every single day carried a silent, physical trap, one fully capable of chewing up your health from the inside out. The problem is, in ancient Egypt, danger rarely came from where you expected it. All that external armor and those priceless perfumes? Absolutely useless when the enemy was hiding silently in your daily plate of food. To grasp this shocking physical vulnerability, we have to look at the very lifeblood of their diet: bread. The flour that fed the empire was ground on massive rustic stones right out in the open air. This meant the relentless desert wind was constantly whipping massive amounts of fine sand and razor-sharp quartz dust straight into their meals. When an Egyptian chewed their food, they weren't just nourishing their bodies. They were literally sandblasting the inside of their own mouths. This constant, grinding friction destroyed tooth enamel so violently that many adults hit their 30s with their teeth worn down to exposed, raw roots. It triggered mind-numbing pain, chronic abscesses, and infections that were all too often lethal. And that is when the jaw-dropping resilience of these people kicked in, forcing them to engineer something completely unprecedented to stop this anatomical nightmare. Caught between widespread agony and the strict spiritual mandate for a pure body, Egyptian doctors invented the very first documented toothpaste in human history. But don't let the modern word fool you. We aren't talking about some soothing, minty gel. The original formula, painstakingly recorded on ancient medical papyri, was an aggressive chemical shock to the system. Crushed rock salt, raw pepper powder, pulverized mint leaves, and dried iris flowers. This gritty, pungent paste was designed to set the mouth on fire. It purged inflamed gums through sheer, agonizing heat, while aggressively attacking the rot and bad breath breeding in their shattered teeth. But there's a practical detail here that perfectly captures the gritty genius of the time. How do you rub a corrosive paste full of pepper and salt into your mouth without destroying your own fingers? To solve this, they invented the world's first toothbrushes. They snapped off small, pliable twigs from specific trees, chewing and deliberately fraying one end until the wood fibers splintered into stiff, functional bristles. Armed with this clever tool, they scrubbed that burning chemical fire directly onto their sand-battered teeth, fighting a painful daily battle just to survive. It completely rewrites the history of ancient dentistry, proving that a simple, clean smile took a massive amount of guts. Yet, no matter how purified an Egyptian's mouth was, an even crueler, more absolute social divide was waiting in the wings. One that exposed a terrifying and deadly reality when the human body simply had to answer nature's call. There is a profoundly revealing detail about the brutal inequality of this civilization that almost always gets skipped in history class. Because no matter how purified and heavily perfumed a pharaoh might be, unforgiving human biology comes to collect its daily toll from all of us, regardless of status. When we think of indoor plumbing, we instinctively picture a modern luxury. But archaeology rips the lid off a fascinating historical truth. Where did the most powerful people in ancient Egypt actually go to the bathroom? The answer reveals a jaw-dropping level of sophistication. Deep inside the grand palaces and elite estates, there were private enclosed restrooms equipped with actual toilet seats, meticulously carved from smooth limestone blocks and custom designed to guarantee absolute privacy and comfort. The catch? The flawless operation of this primitive plumbing relied entirely on the sweat and grueling labor of an invisible underclass. Directly beneath these luxurious seats were deep pits packed with fine desert sand, strategically placed to instantly absorb liquids and trap the overwhelming stench. Day in and day out, servants faced the grim, highly toxic task of manually emptying those heavy containers and hauling in fresh sand, ensuring the royal chambers remained absolutely spotless. For the high nobility, going to the bathroom was a strictly hygienic, heavily shielded retreat from biological danger. And that is exactly where this sanitary divide turned into a silent, devastating tragedy for everyone else. The second you stepped outside those towering stone gates and walked into the overcrowded peasant villages, the landscape shifted dramatically and lethally. For the massive working class that kept the empire running, there wasn't a single trace of infrastructure. Humble families had to make do with simple holes dug in the dirt outside their homes. Or, worst of all, they used the muddy banks of the Nile itself to relieve themselves. This completely shatters what we know about the brutal life expectancy of the ancient world. Remember, the Nile was the exact same water source where these people took their daily exfoliating baths and drew water to bake their bread. By dumping human waste right there, they were blindly feeding a devastating cycle of cross-contamination. Stagnant pools quickly morphed into superbreeders for bacteria and microscopic parasites, sparking terrifying rampant outbreaks of dysentery and infections that wiped out countless lives. The ultimate line between the long, comfortable life of the aristocracy and the agonizingly early death of the poor wasn't just drawn by access to good food. It was drawn by the simple, life-or-death privilege of having a clean place to go to the bathroom. As we've seen throughout our journey across the sands of time, the daily hygiene routine of ancient Egypt was light years away from being a shallow matter of vanity or a petty royal whim. It was, in the cold, hard light of day, the ultimate proof of human ingenuity. A relentless, daily fight for survival against an environment that simply did not forgive weakness. These people used stunning practical intelligence to weaponize a deadly lead poison into the first preventive medicine in history. They took the brutal, raw salt of the desert and turned it into their daily soap, forging complex purification rituals that still echo in our own bathrooms today. Peeling back this raw, gritty reality from behind the untouchable gold masks of the pharaohs forces us to appreciate the comforts of our modern world, and it brings us face to face with the true, beating heart of the people who built human history. If you love traveling back in time like this, ripping away the Hollywood filters to discover how the ancient world actually worked, hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty of other doors to history just waiting to be kicked open. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible ride today. Take care, and we'll see you next time.